All right. So let me welcome you to day 2 of the Kasimovian workshop. We had a really good day yesterday, and I think we're going to have a really interesting day today. Next slide, please. Okay, here's the schedule of talks. You'll see that the talks are really focused on what I would call physical parameters, climate, tectonics, sedimentation, etc. These are important parameters to consider, particularly for the later talks in the next days, where we're going to talk about the biotic events of the Kasimovian, which in a Darwinian world are largely driven at some level by these types of physical events. Next slide. So I've broken it down in my own mind into the idea that we're going to talk about or listen to 6 topics being discussed. The first one, of course, will be patterns of deposition. We're going to have 2 talks to talk about that, about sedimentation essentially and what drives it. We're going to have a talk about dust, which is a subject that really until fairly recently I think has been ignored or not really considered as important as it was in terms of driving not only physical factors but also affecting the biosphere. We're going to talk, of course, about ice ages because we know the Kasimovian is part of the late Paleozoic ice ages. We're also going to talk about paleosols, which act as archives of climate. And then we're going to see some actual climate modeling for the late Pennsylvanian. And then, of course, we'll talk about a really classic topic, which are sedimentary cycles of deposition during the late Pennsylvanian. And of course, these are not separate topics in a sense. They're all part of a very dynamic planet, and they all feed back and interact with each other. And what I've shown on the right are just 2 examples of Kasimovian sediment strata that are actually quite near to me. They're both in New Mexico, and it shows you really great contrast. The Kinney Quarry, which is very close to Albuquerque where I sit, where we have the deposits of the shallow marine embayment that were prograded over by a delta front, and then the Canyon del Cobre, which is farther north in northern New Mexico, where the later Pennsylvanian is the beds that are low on the canyon wall, the darker red to brown beds, and these are all fluvial strata, fluvial red beds, classic red beds, but classic red beds here that go right up through the Pennsylvanian into the lower Permian, which is a rare occurrence. Next slide. Well, when we talk about depositional patterns, of course, we're going to see some discussion of what I call the sort of trinity of sedimentation, of drivers of sedimentation, tectonics, used to see climate. Of course, out here where I live, the ancestral Rocky Mountain orogeny took place largely as a result of the collision of Gondwana and La Russia. And this had a huge effect on local environments, on deposition, and of course, on what we understand of the Kasimovian record in the American West. Next slide. And as I mentioned, dust, which our speaker, Lynn Sorgan, has been studying with her collaborators quite a bit in the last few years. Dust actually has an important effect on the biosphere, both in marine and in non-marine settings. And it's something, like I said, that I don't think has been given the kind of attention it merits in the past. And I think we're going to see some serious attention paid to it today. Next slide. Ice ages. Okay, I mean, this is one of Ron Blakey's wonderful pieces of artwork, maps. And of course, we talked about this yesterday. Ice ages are a big factor during the late Paleozoic. And as Bill noted yesterday, this is the last set of great ice ages before the late Cenozoic ice ages, which we are living in. Next slide. Paleosols, well, paleosols are important archives of climate. This is something Larry Tanner and I just published on some late Kasimovian calcareous paleosols right here in New Mexico. So there are a lot of paleosols, and I think Ron will talk about paleosols in his talk about the Appalachian Basin as well. Next slide. And, climate, to me, the bigger understanding of climate also involves modeling, which is what Sophia Makarowicz will talk about. This is a diagram from one of her recent papers with collaborators. And next slide. And of course, one of the most interesting things about sedimentation, at least in part of the Carboniferous, is the cyclicity of sedimentation, which is well known from the classic cyclothems of the North American mid-continent, which provide, among other things, an astrochronology, a potential astrochronology for part of Carboniferous time. And Phil Heckel will, of course, talk about this subject. Next slide. So to summarize, I always like to say we live on a Darwinian planet in which environmental change is one of the primary drivers of evolution. And the talks today are important in their own sense to climate modelers and sedimentologists, et cetera. But they also provide, I hope, some good background to the next 2 days when we'll just be talking about paleontology. And we already got a taste of this yesterday where we talked about what might have caused extinctions, for example, in the marine and terrestrial realm around the beginning of the Kasimovian. So I like to think of today as a really good setup for the next 2 days.